Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We are here with Zevi Slavin of Seekers of Unity. Thank you, Zevi, for being here today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Brett.
And so Zevi, you're here, and you've had some great conversations with John. You had 4 voices with Fakie, and you've had some Dialogos conversations, and mostly focusing on mysticism. Now, in your first conversation with John, you, about halfway through, you asked John an introductory question, which you had said you had wanted to ask him at the beginning. But I'm going to ask this of you now at the beginning of our conversation, which is, who are you?
Wow, it's the question which we spend a lifetime trying to answer, I think. I think there's a dual thing going on here where we see ourselves as participating in the totality of reality, and therefore to answer that question truly, we have to say we are the all in some sense. We are what some traditions may call God, and to consider ourselves any less than that is to do a disservice to ourselves and to the rest of existence. But in terms of actually answering the question in a way that might be useful to people in the particularity of how this thing that we call the self manifests, I am a young Australian male. I'm Jewish. I was raised in a Chabad community. For those that know, it is a form of Hasidic Judaism, which is a form of Jewish mysticism, a mass movement of Jewish mysticism, which we can talk about. And I was raised studying Jewish mysticism from a very early age in primary texts, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in Aramaic. And I somehow stumbled upon Christian mysticism, which is not something which is supposed to be part of my education. And I found so much commonality between what I'd been studying in my own Hasidic, very particularistic Jewish classes of mysticism and the Christian mystics, which was a real shocking discovery when I was 15 or 16. And it led me on a long path of reading and thinking and experiencing and meditating. And this kind of discovery of what I think is best termed as perennialistic mysticism or perennialistic interpretation of mysticism, although it's a term which is also what to talk about and means different things to different people. But as a general umbrella, I think it's a helpful one. And I've just been pursuing that passion and trying to follow it where it takes me and trying to be inspired by the messages, the truth, the beauty, and goodness that I find therein. So I identify as a seeker, as a searcher, as someone who is trying to explore these mysteries and see how they can best shape us and guide us to build a beautiful world together. I think that's who I am at the moment.
Well, that's great. Thanks for that. Now, so you talked about bringing a perennialist Jewish voice. What is perennialism?
Yeah. Perennial literally just means that thing which keeps coming back again and again, like a perennial flower is a flower that continues to bloom over the years. Perennialism, when it comes to the study of mysticism, is a term which is really first used in the Renaissance. There's a group of philosophers who are working, sponsored by the Medicis. Most notably is Pico del Mirangela and Marcello Ficino, and they begin a project of synthesizing the 2 dominant schools of philosophy during the Middle Ages, which was Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, and I'm happy to explain either of those in greater depth, but they were always seen as contradictory and irreconcilable. And they began this work of trying to bring them together. And once that project was seeming to be successful, they thought, why don't we do that as well to, the great conflicting religions that we exist between? So they were Christian scholars, and they tried to see where they could find a way to reconcile Judaism and Christianity. And they saw that the most successful avenue to do that would be through the mystical traditions of each, where they saw a lot of commonality, with the assumption that things in their external form, in their exoteric form, are very different, but as you peel away the layers, you find more and more similarity and unity. And that's what they began doing. And this term wasn't coined by them; it was coined a little while later by a Vatican librarian, Stuccono, and he coins this term perennialism, which then gets picked up. It has its own little history, which might take some time to go through, but it gets picked up in the modern period, most famously by people like William James and Aldous Huxley, and by the Theosophists in different ways. But basically, a bunch of modern thinking people who begin to see the power that religion may have to move the world in a positive direction, and to see that as not something which has to be done by any particular religion to the exclusion of others, but something that can be done in collaboration between religions, and also not just in religion, but also religion together with science and together with psychology and together with all kinds of modern discoveries that modernity have brought. And that project writ large becomes known as perennialism. And I think it is important to remember that there are different moments in history where that term is used differently, but the general gist of it is this attempt to see how mysticism across diverse traditions shares common points that lead us together in the same direction. That's I think a general umbrella of this term perennialism.
Great. And let, and I want to talk about Jewish mysticism, but what is mysticism? What does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. These are another very difficult question. Mysticism, there is no consensus amongst scholars today what mysticism is. The closest thing we have to a consensus is that mysticism is an unmediated, direct experience of ultimate reality. That's one at least, hot definition that runs now. And it's a very debated term because when we try to define anything, we run into the basic problems of universals and particulars. So it seems to us that there are things that are universal amongst mystical traditions which warrant us calling them mystical. But when we try and dig into what exactly it is that unites them, we then also, as we get our noses closer up to the subject matter, we can also see the differences between those things, and that makes giving a definition very difficult. And for a long time, there was a simple definition that was given by the perennialists, that there's sort of this unified or non-dual reality which the individual can come to experience firsthand, and that was what all mystical traditions shared and all mystical experiences shared. That term was very much contested by a wave of scholarship known as the constructivists or the contextualists, headed by Stephen Katz, and kind of pulled away from the naive universalistic assumptions that the perennialists had made, and it made us rethink a lot of these things that were taken for granted. And I think in a healthy way, it brought a critical analysis back to the field, which had become a bit too romanticized with the unity and didn't see the differentiation. And I think differentiation is important. I think difference is beautiful when it's done right. So that was a swing against the perennialist in terms of trying to define the term mysticism, but then there may be space today for a reconciliation between those two positions. And the definition which I gravitate to, which follows sort of the critique of the contextualists, is definition that mysticism is comprised of three components, not just experience, where the emphasis was placed solely before, but it's made up of experience, theory, and practice. And practice means both one's own personal private practice and their ethical practice towards themselves and others in the world around them. And I think that there's something, and this is the definition, a definition given by Peter Moore and others, that there's something about the experience, the theory, and the practice that are all unitive. There's a unitive experience, unitive theories, or attempts to try and make sense of that experience in conjunction with the multiplicity of reality, and then practices that go and try and put that unity into practice, or try to lead one's life in a way that facilitates unity both internally and externally. So if you had to ask me what I think mysticism means, I think mysticism means, at least for now, and I'm open to changing my mind as I continue to learn and be challenged, I think it means unitive experiences, unitive theories, and unitive practices.
So these mystical, what a mystical, do we say a mystical religion? Is that how we phrase it? Does it provide a set of practices that help people have mystical experiences?
Yes. So within mystical traditions and within religions that contain streams of mysticism, there definitely are practices that have been developed and cultivated, and every tradition is different and the same in some ways here, but basic forms of altering the human. There's like, we can split them into two categories. There's the physiological practices, so fasting and breathing and dancing and walking in certain ways, all these sort of bodily practices that a person can engage in, and those are all things that are enshrined by these traditions forms of prayer and mantra, and these are all thousands of years old, and they have quite good results in inducing these experiences. And then there's the general category of contemplative and meditative practices as well, which aren't necessarily bodily, but they're also embodied in some way, so they're not really separate from the first category. But those are more directly trying to engage the mind, the embodied mind, in trying to move to a place of unity. I should add that although in contemporary, more New Age circles, the pursuit of the experience has a lot of premium and people are trying to get at the experience, from my understanding, in mystical traditions and religions that had streams of mysticism classically, the pursuit of the mystical experience was never something which was really central at all. It was secondary, and the mystics themselves decry people chasing experiences. They see it as simply another form of spiritual hedonism, another form of egoism, and instead they're much more concerned with what do these what does our tradition, whichever tradition they're speaking from, have to say from the people that have already had these experiences, and how therefore should one live their life in accordance with these things, instead of just living a life in terms of in an attempt to pursue the experience. I think that's an important point to mention when talking about mystical experience.
Does intentionally trying to achieve a mystical experience impede one from having a mystical experience?
Yeah, there's certainly much discussion of that in literature. The mystics, it seemed across the board, agree that you can't actually evoke a mystical experience. All you can do is you can prepare yourself for one, if and when it comes, it's simply the grace of God, the universe, nature, whatever, in whatever tradition is using, it's whatever language it's using. But it's not something which it's not something which one can bring upon themselves. It's something which one can only prepare themselves for if by grace they're so chosen to be the recipients of the experience. And we see the same thing in the discussions of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, where the person can't induce a prophetic experience. They can simply prepare themselves that if they're worthy of it, then it will chance upon them.
And well, can I ask, have you had any of these experiences?
I prefer not to answer that question.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. What can I ask though? We talk here a lot about having an ecology of practices, so a set of practices
Yes.
that help cultivate the traits that we want. Can you talk about your ecology of practices?
Sure. So I belong to the Hasidic community, as I began by saying, and the Hasidic community is part of, at least the way that sociologists will tell you, we're part of what's considered Orthodox Judaism. And Orthodoxy, simply put, from a stance of practice, not speaking theologically, but from a stance of practice, means that we have a set of rules, halachot. Halacha literally means the way in Hebrew, the path, the Tao, it might be translated as, which is a really full prescribed chart and journey which one takes in their practice from the very first breath they take as a baby when they come into this world to the very last breath that one takes when they leave this world and beyond, because halacha also continues to, the practices and rituals around death, mourning, bereavement, burial, and not just from the very first breath to the last breath, but also in one's day, from the very first moment one wakes up till the very moment one goes to sleep. There is always something that halacha mandates that one ought to be doing at that moment. And the way it's typically seen from a more normative, from a more stereotypical Jewish perspective, is that these are the divine commandments that were given at Sinai, that God, classically in Judaism, there's 613 commandments, and there's many, many more once the rabbis get involved and add their fingers to the pie. A complex history of development, which we could go into another time. But the vision that there's some sort of commandment here, there's this divine voice calling, is something of a description which gets attenuated and changed a little by the mystics, where they see the mitzvot, these commandments, these practices, this ecology of practices throughout one's day, in every aspect of one's day, as something which is an expression of the true will of the self. And they see that when the tradition says that this is what God demands or God commands, is simply saying that this is what the collective spirit of existence would want to happen. And when we can tap into that, it's no longer a commandment, but it is what we ourselves want to do. And I think a lot of the practice of a lot of the practice, a lot of the tension sometimes between these commandments, halachot as they're called, and the spirit of Judaism is finding where these things are emerging from within ourselves. And to get a bit less esoteric, to be a bit more practical for a second, when we wake up in the morning, we begin with an expression of gratitude. We say, "Moda ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayim, shechazarta minishmati b'chem l'rabba amnotecha." We thank God. We thank the Majesty, the Master of the universe, for restoring within us our soul, for giving us back our soul, that we can have a new day, a fresh day, to be present. And we thank God for having the trust in us. We continue by washing our hands, some very deeply ritualistic symbolic act. We pray 3 times a day, beginning with Shachrit in the morning. When we eat, we make a blessing before we eat to be mindful of not taking food for granted. When we finish eating, we thank God again. There's a full practice, and really every single part of one's day, the way that a practicing Jew uses the bathroom and thanks God after using the bathroom for that all of their cavities and bodily functions worked, which is miraculous. And when done properly, one can really be in tune how every single part of one's day, every single part of one's life is nothing short of miraculous. And I think that's very much what the ecology of practices are, and particularly within the Hasidic tradition, to bring one's mindfulness and to bring one's full intentionality into everything that one does. Often formulaically, often by citing a Hebrew formula before beginning it, but the intention is to bring the mind to what it is that one's doing, to be doing it with full consciousness and full presence of the divine in that moment and in that act.
Right. And I'll ask one more question before getting to questions from the audience. You talked about that mysticism focuses on an unmediated direct experience of ultimate reality. How do we know what is ultimate reality?
So it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question for philosophers who are dealing with the reports of the mystics and asking, is this veridical? Is this true, what they're experiencing? And it's interesting as well for many philosophers for many mystics who themselves are also philosophers, who are philosophically minded people, whether that's people like Ibn Arabi or Al-Ghazali or Shankara or Nagarjuna or Plotinus or Meister Eckhart. These are deep thinking people, Hildegard of Bingen, and they want to know, are these experiences real? And I think the best summation that's given of that question is done by William James in his great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And James, who takes a very, very, very sympathetic stance towards mysticism, he takes a perennialist approach, as we've been saying, and he sees it as really an answer to many of the woes of modernity. And the conclusion that he comes to, and it's a conclusion shared by many, it's shared by a colleague of his, Bertrand Russell, in his somewhat well-known article, Logic and Mysticism. And the conclusion is that for the mystic, it is very, very clear that these experiences are 100% veridical and unquestionable and undoubtable. For one of the characteristics, James gives a bunch of characteristics. We spoke about some of them earlier. He talks about passivity and transience and ineffability, but he has this fourth one called the noetic aspect. And for James, and this is something which John Vervaeke speaks about a lot as well, the experience is so real that in comparison to the experience, what we call everyday reality, he puts it in terms of consciousness. What we call everyday consciousness pales in its salience towards the mystical experience. So the mystical experience is not only thought to be real, it's thought to be so much more real, incomparably real. I don't know how to say that word, compared to our everyday experience. Which is a very fascinating thing, and John makes this case that there's an ontonormativity to that, which means that it's so real that it forces us to rethink and change the way that we behave in our everyday lives, which is a really wild thing. And I mean, a lot of the research that's going in today into mystical experience and psychedelics and mysticism speak about how one quote unquote mystical experience, I say quote unquote because it is a contentious term, can really transform someone's life. People that are struggling with addiction, with PTSD, with depression. So there's a certain realness to it that's able to transform what we think is real into the illusion, and then to change our lives according to the new real. So the question of is it real? I think for the mystic, for the experiencer, 100%. The question of whether a case can be made persuasively for someone who has not had the experience, So James takes a very sensible position and he says no. James says no, that it's only real for the person who experiences it, but there's really nothing that one can do to export that experience. He believes that it's totally ineffable. We can't even speak about it to the outsider. And that's a safe position to take, and I'm okay with that position. I think that we could go a bit further than James by shifting our focus from the experience to the metaphysics. And we can ask, what is the mystic coming back and reporting to us? What are they telling what are they telling us about their experience? And this is something that actually John and I disagreed with during the dialogues about whether there are valid propositions which the mystic can come back and make. I think there might be, and I think there are metaphysical and epistemological propositions which they can make, which moves us away from the realm of experience, which moves us away from the realm of your question. So maybe I'll stop it at that, and leave that as the answer.
Well, I was hoping you'd go on. So what kind of propositions are we talking about here? That's that's interesting.
I think I feel like I set myself up for this question. I feel like the fundamental proposition of mysticism, across time, across ages, and this is a proposition. This is very debated, and I'm willing to debate it, because I'm currently persuaded by it. It's not an axiom which I'm taking on faith or as a dogma. It's simply what I find to be persuasive in the present, is that reality, in some sense. So the metaphysical claim is this. So just to break down what the word metaphysics means for a second. Physics, we all know, is the science of the demonstrable and testable functions of the matter in reality that we exist in. And metaphysics is that which is literally after or beyond physics. The term comes from Aristotle, where he writes a book called Physics, because Aristotle was also a scientist back in the day. To be a philosopher meant to also be a scientist. It was all under the same umbrella. And he writes a book after physics, and it's called Metaphysics because it's the book that comes after his book called Physics. And I don't think it's even him who gives it the name. I think it's his son who gives it the title. But in that book, he talks about all the things which we now know as metaphysics. So he's talking about the basic question of metaphysics that he addresses in the book is there some sort of reality out there, and what is the fundamental structure of that reality? The same way as for ethics, the question is there something called the good, and if so, what is the good? Same question for aesthetics: is there beautiful? What is the beauty? So when it comes to metaphysics, is there reality? If so, what is the fundamental structure of reality? And questions of Aristotle deals with questions of time, causality, creation, the eternity. All of these things are metaphysical questions. But I think the basic question here of metaphysics is, what is the fundamental nature of reality? That is the basic question. And I think it's an important question. It's a question which was now it's a bit different, but recently it was thrown out of philosophy by the move towards analytical philosophy, because we felt, following Wittgenstein, that there was nothing that we could talk about the nature of reality itself. It simply was beyond what we could speak, and therefore we should not speak at all. But I think that the question of what is the fundamental nature of reality is a very important one, and I think it's one which ultimately, and this is a case which Aldous Huxley makes very beautifully, it's a conception which ultimately drives the way that we choose to live, to interact, to think, and to live our lives accordingly in some sort of conformity to what we think the fundamental nature of reality is. And in contradistinction to, I think, the dominant form of scientism, materialistic view of reality, that everything in reality is, at least this is before the changes that have been coming thanks to quantum physics and the new sciences as they're called, that everything in reality is just these discrete, billiard balls of molecules. Everything is just bouncing around, just molecules in motion, and there's no real grand interconnectivity there. Everything is just discrete objects, and we can analyze everything as such. And there's a real separation in that analysis between the subject and the object. I think mysticism comes and says fundamentally that the fundamental nature of reality is that it is unified, interconnected, interdependent, or non-dual. And I'm not conflating those descriptions, but I think those are the cluster of descriptions that mysticism comes to approach. And to put it in metaphysical terms, the basic separation that we create between subject and object, according to the mystics, I believe, they think no longer exists, that there is no separation between subject and object fundamentally, although that may be one state of consciousness. On a more fundamental level, reality is one. There is no separation of subject and object, and therefore there's no me and you, there's no us and them, there's no then and now, there's no here and there. Everything is fundamentally one, ever present, interconnected, interdependent. And I think that that vision is tremendously beautiful, tremendously compelling. There is very, very strong cases to be made philosophically for this monistic or non-dualistic position. Baruch Spinoza makes it most famously in the West. Shankara and Nagarjuna make it most famously, I think, in the East. And so I think there's actually a very, very strong, powerful, robust metaphysic to support it. So there's the truth component. I think it's immensely beautiful. I think it's empirical as because there is the experience that backs it up, and that experience is one of beauty and sacrality and transcendence and presence, which are paradoxical, but paradoxicality is part of the experience. And I think it's also tremendously demanding. I think it really makes an ethical claim upon us to act as if everything was one, interconnected and interdependent. How would we treat people around us, the world around us, if we thought that it was all fundamentally one, if it was all fundamentally us, if it was all fundamentally God? So I think there's a very strong ethical component. So I think that on the Greek trifecta, it scores all three, where there's truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's what I think the proposition of the mystic is, that reality is fundamentally united, unified, and one. And that's my that's my hot take.
Thanks. If we have time, we'll pick up on that. But Lynn has a question. How does mysticism transcend dogma within the people of a culture?
Yeah. So that's a really great question, Lynn. I think that mysticism can become dogmatic, and we definitely see that historically, and that's a shame. I think I think the way that it transcends dogma is that in its inception, the mystic or the prophet or the shaman, whatever the term is going to be used in any tradition, when they have their experience, because the experience is ineffable to the mystic, they cannot put it into language. They cannot come back and say what exactly it was that they experienced. It seems to go really beyond that. Um, it's therefore something which is not subject to dogma. It's something which shadows dogma, and I think that you see this within the historical literature of mysticism, mystics that were within a tradition who have a tremendous amount of dogma, and there's a lot of debate here about the relationship between religious dogma and the experience and which one interprets which. But it's very clear to me that the mystics that are sort of burdened, or the religionists that are burdened by dogma, who then have mystical experiences, see how either the dogma which they were holding onto was just nonsense, or more likely, they see how the dogma was actually pointing to a truth which the people who were espousing the dogma had no idea what they were even saying with their own words. And I think there's really great examples in every tradition, and I can go into details, but I think that mysticism transcends dogma because it totally shatters and redefines it. The danger is when the words which then are spoken by the prophet, by the mystic, by the shaman, by the fakir, when they get turned back into dogma, it's then that we need a new revival and we need a new shattering. I think that's the relationship between mysticism and dogma.
Valeria, you have a question.
Yeah, first, thank you. And my question is, there is this metaphor of the map and the territory, like the map is not the territory. And my question is mysticism the direct exploration of the territory? And maybe dogma is related to the map? And how is the experiences that one gets from the direct exploration be used to update the maps? So it's a little bit, question about the map and the territory metaphor in relation to the things we're talking about.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah. That's a really great question. So that the map territory relationship is a really great one, because it points to this issue where we do have these maps that religions and that ideologies and sciences create, which are fundamentally separate from the territory because they're only mapping the territory. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. The dogma can be seen as the map, and the experience itself, what's encountered, which I don't really like to call experience because it's something which transcends experience itself, because experience is predicated on a separation between the experiencer and the experienced, which is precisely what's undone by mysticism. But but I think that mysticism is that place where the terrain itself is encountered. Um, what can happen, what tends to happen is that mysticism itself, it's an ism, right? And its words and its books, it itself becomes a map. It might be a closer map, it might be a more accurate map, but it's still a map. It's not mysticism is not the terrain itself. It's that which, to use the Eastern metaphor, it's the finger pointing to the moon, but it may not be the moon itself. And I think it's important to remember that, and particularly when we get into the metaphysical and cosmological weeds of various given mystical traditions, we can begin to get lost. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Jewish mysticism, we speak about four worlds, right? There's Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya. Now, the Kabbalists all know that these are metaphors. They're metaphors for a plethora of things, for states of consciousness, for moments of divine and human creativity. But if someone actually gets stuck and thinks that there is a place called Atzilus and they can take a rocket ship and get there, they've taken what was more terrenal and they've turned it into more mapping, and they've really lost themselves. Part of what I think the beauty of doing comparative mysticism is that when you take various different traditions and you begin to contrast their maps with one another, you could start to get a sense of which parts are just cultural and extraneous, and which parts are actually closer to the terrain itself. And I think that's the one of the great advantages of doing a careful comparison between the maps of different traditions.
Can I do a little follow-up, Brett?
Yeah, of course.
So when I hear that, the thing that comes to my mind is that comparison in the reading of the different maps is completely different to somebody who has involved themselves in some kind of mystical tradition or some kind of more direct exploration. Once you have done that, you see the maps in a completely different way. At least that's the experience of the people that I have talked to in my own experience. Do you think that this comparison of the maps being done without having had some kind of direct exploration is very fruitful, or do you need to have some experience of the direct before you can fully understand what the maps are talking about?
That's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting question, and it's one which is debated among mystics and scholars of mysticism. I think to use a very simple analogy, right? If you're given addresses to go to some place to visit a friend's apartment, so we have the maps, right? You have the instructions of how to get there. You go down the street, you turn left, you go to the traffic light, you go up 4 flights of stairs. That's a map. Now, if you have multiple maps and multiple people give you directions, you have a visual map, you have an auditory map, you now have better maps and you have a better sense. But I don't think that those compare to having actually been there oneself, to having actually walked up the flight of stairs. There's no comparison when a person's actually done that. And I think for that reason, if someone simply remains a cartographer of mysticism, someone who's drawing and studying the maps, then it's important to recognize that that's where they are, and that's okay. But it is different from someone that has the intimate first-hand experience. On the flip side, and this is the counter argument which is given, is that and I think it's a weak argument. I'll be honest about it. The counter argument is that if one is trying to be as objective as they can about trying to ascertain what's going on here, if they're colored by their own particularistic experience, right, they may not be able to appreciate the experience of the other, or the universality of the experience. So, for example, if I'm a Catholic mystic and I have a mystical experience in where I see the Mother Mary coming to me, when I then read the literature of the Buddhist mystic and they have a whole different vision, I may say, oh, that's nonsense. They didn't see the Mother Mary, therefore their mysticism is rubbish. So I think there's both advantages and disadvantages to the intimacy of the mystic with their experience. The obvious advantage is that there's a sense of knowing which is not able to be achieved in any other way than by knowing it in that way itself. The disadvantage is that it may cut one off from other experiences. I think though that also to re-stress the move away from experience, which I think is important, I think what's more important than either having the experience oneself or studying all the maps and being an expert in the ways around mysticism, I think what's more important than both of those things is looking at what these experiences and maps demand of us and trying to live our lives accordingly. I honestly think, I, I don't think it needs to be argued very difficultly, that there are people who have wild mystical experiences. They can be precipitated by psychedelics or any other thing, and they're just not really, they're not good people. They're lousy partners and lousy friends and bad spouses. They're irresponsible. They're hurt people and they hurt others, and it's a sad reality. And then there could be people who have no experience of the no direct experience of mysticism, but are thoroughly moved by the beauty of it, by the poetry of it, by the philosophy of it, by the phenomenology of it, whatever it is, and they live their lives accordingly. I think the mystics themselves would be far more in accordance to say that's actually the point of it. The point is not to be having these shattering experiences. They're great, but unless you're changing your life and moving forward, then like what good are you doing? We're now just reading Martin Buber together with John Vervaeke and Guy Sensak, and Martin Buber makes this case very strongly. He says that there's this in German Erbelis's experience, and he says that experience can be detached from Lebens, from life, and what's more important is a life to live in accordance with the values of the mystic, the values of unity, of peace, of love, of compassion, of understanding, as opposed to someone who's just getting their rocks off on the experience. And so I think that's an important thing to reemphasize.
Thank you very much for the answers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Manuel, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks for showing up. I like the pushback you were able to give in the last episode of you and Fakie, the series that you made. And unfortunately, that's all that I've seen. So if I'm going over territory that's already tread, forgive me. So the thing that I'm dancing around is forbidden knowledge, right? Like you kind of touched on it with this idea that people have these experiences and they don't incorporate it, they don't integrate it within their lives. They don't draw the meaning from the thing. So yeah, like you touched on it with Fakie a little bit, and I wanted to have your opinion around that.
Yeah, I think is your question in relation to what we've been saying up until now? Is this or is this a new question?
Well, the question is more so like, okay, so let's assume that there's this path to being, right? Like where this map is going, right? Like you have to get out of the door first, right? And you can't step in the car without learning how to drive, and basically that's the dilemma that I'm looking at, where like a lot of people want to drive without knowing how to walk.
Yeah. So this question of integrating the being itself into our lives and taking the meaning from these experiences and implying them and living them, I think would be very challenging if we had no experience of that. So if we, to use your analogy of someone who has no idea how to drive at all, you chuck them, you take someone out of the Amazon, and you chuck them in. They've never seen a car before, and you chuck them behind the steering wheel. They don't know what a car is. They don't know what the brakes and the pedals are. They don't know. So I think that would certainly be challenging. My intuition, though, and I think this is something which the mystics speak about quite a bit, is that the state of being in alignment with reality is not something which is a destination which until we reach it is fundamentally alien from us. It's actually where we begin. It's where we start. And it's the ever-present nature of reality which always is there and which we can never truly escape either. To use some of like the classic imagery, the Bible speaks about how Adam and Eve were created in paradise, in the Garden of Eden, right? And paradise by the mystics of the Abrahamic faiths, they see that as the mystical state of being, a state of being in unity and bliss, a messianic place. We could use that term as well. And what they learn from the fact that the Bible begins with that state of being, the Bible doesn't begin with the Israelites wandering through the desert, being lost and confused. It doesn't begin in a state of exile and destruction. It begins in a state of paradise. And they see this as reflecting the human experience, where the human begins by being a baby, an embryo in the mother's womb. And the mystics see the womb as the perfect metaphor for the experience of the mystic of being in the womb of nature, being in the womb of God, where there's a total symbiotic relationship between the individual, between the embryonic individual and the mother, the world around them, which nourishes them and nurtures them and cares for them and holds them. And there's actually, it's interesting, is that there's a Freudian critique of mysticism, that it's simply the human desire to return back through the vagina, back into the womb. It's a very Freudian imagery there. But this notion that state of unity, that state of love, there's a famous quote from Mandela, which has become a cliche now, but I think it's so true and powerful, that children don't naturally hate. We teach children that there's us and them, and that there's better and worse, and that these people are dangerous. But I think our natural state of being, and this maybe have a bit of like a Rousseauian romantic naivety to it, but I really do think that the natural human state of being on a metaphysical, on a religious, on a biological level is a state of symbiosis, is a state of compassion, is a state of unity. So yes, it would be very difficult to come to that state if we were never there before, but I think not only were we there before and we're returning to paradise, we're returning to Eden in the cosmic and personal sense, but I think it's also the state which is ever present. It's the state which always is there for us to tap into. And because it's the true nature of our being, I believe, it's not alien to us. It cannot be alien to us. Nicholas of Cusa, a 13th century cardinal and Christian mystic, said, God is none other than the none other. The thing that which can never be other than us or other from us, that is precisely the mystical. So I think for that reason, we're in safe hands. We always were behind the wheel and always are.
So, is that an argument that these traditions aren't abused and that people who are following these paths never stray? Like, because that's implied.
It's a difficult question. And when we get into the realm of whether these traditions are abused and whether they go the wrong path, and that could be a path into inaction, whether that's quietism, it could be a path into incorrect action, and that could be mystical traditions that actually do lead to violence and racism. So it's an interesting question. I think there's kind of two ways to respond to it. One way is to respond within our current paradigm, which is an important paradigm. It's the paradigm we live in, and in that paradigm, it's very important to have very concrete values of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, and things which we instinctively know to be true. It's what Wordsworth calls what is his phrase for it? I should have thought of the phrase before quoting him, but it's an idea which goes back to Thomas Aquinas, that there's this sense of the moral certitude within our bosom that what we know to be true. And I think that the mystics only make this more powerful with their case of the demand of unity and what comes with that is a demand for love and understanding and compassion. And I think therefore on that metric we can and we must and we should criticize mystics and mysticism when they go down the wrong path. And that has happened. There have been mystical traditions that have gone into very, very bizarre, xenophobic, racist, hateful places. There's a tremendous amount of research that's been done now on the amount of mysticism and occultism and magic that was present in the Third Reich and in amongst the high ranks of Nazism. There's a tremendous amount of caste enforced social discrimination, which is based on principles of mysticism, and this is really replete. Even, I mean, Julius Evola has been a character that's received a lot of criticism for his supporting of Italian fascism, and he was a mystic. There's a whole school of mysticism known as traditionalism, which I think goes into a very dark and ugly place. And I think it's our responsibility to see those things as ugly and call them out. But that's from a perspective of the here and now, of the everyday. There is a second perspective that mysticism does speak of, which is a state of simply being, which is beyond good and evil. to use a term which gets picked up by Nietzsche, but it's a term which is actually used by the mystics before him. Rumi uses it, for example, and in that state, there's a recognition that everything that is and everything that happens is being itself and is perfect, and the real challenge is to hold both of those truths together simultaneously in ways that afford each other to flourish. And they're totally paradoxical. And I think the highest sign of sanity is to be able to be in a space where one both recognizes how every moment of reality is perfect and is already redeemed and is already paradisical and is already unified, and simultaneously how far we are from a state of reality which is unified and paradisical and and godly and loving. And to be able to simultaneously work towards that vision which the other side of oneself believes is already here, I think it is the ethical paradox of mysticism, and I don't think it's a simple one, and I think it's one which needs to be lived in tension constantly.
So you're making a value judgment between one form of mysticism and another one. Like, what is the basis that you can make that judgment on?
I think the basis of that value judgment is made from mysticism itself, and I think that you can have a body of a thing, right? Let's say you have a patient that comes into a hospital, right? And we look at the way that their cells are functioning. They're mostly doing well. There are some cells that have become, gangrenous or cancerous or whatever it is, tumorous. And when we look at the rest of the cells of the human body, we see a flourishing symbiotic organism that's working to support the whole entire flourishing of the human. And then there are some parts of it which we see there's something that's going wrong, which we may not quite understand, but they've become destructive. They've become dead. They've become necrotic. They're beginning to consume the healthy flesh, and if we don't stop them, then this organism will not survive. And I think that when we look at the organism, when we look at the body of mysticism as a whole, I think we see a tremendous amount of symbiotic, healthy interchange and flow within traditions, between traditions. And then I think that we see on the extremities and we see internally, there are aspects, and I think this is true. I'm not doing this to call out any one particular tradition. I have to call out my own tradition. In Jewish mysticism, there is a tremendous amount of xenophobia, and there's a tremendous amount of dehumanization of the Christian. And I can understand where that's coming from. These were written by men who had their families massacred by Christian pogroms and crusades. And without judging them or without and neither justifying them, we could say that part that they expressed, where they speak about the Christian in very negative terms, in satanic terms, in whatever it is, that part is an aberration. And that part, compared to the rest of the healthy body of mysticism, is something that we need to understand. You don't get angry at someone for having cancer in their body. You see that is not going to be helpful to the flourishing of the body as a whole, and you do what you can to extract it. And I think that the responsibility of doing that is a real one. It needs to be done with compassion and with kindness and with love, and trying not to destroy the body in the process. But I think that when we look at what mysticism as a whole demands, when the mystics themselves call for unconditional love, for unity, for compassion, for justice, for oneness, for interconnectivity, you can then judge the parts of itself which aren't living up to its own standards and treat them, remove them accordingly. That's I think how one makes that value judgment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vin. You have a question. I think Zevi touched on it, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually seems pretty relevant to what was brought up a second ago. And so I guess the question is, so are there certain tendencies or red flags that you would use personally, kind of your experience with the mystical traditions in Judaism, to kind of like mark what might be like a healthy mystical tradition or group versus like a pathological cult? And kind of like in the frame of reference, to flesh it out a little bit, is like, okay, so you can definitely have someone who is saying, well, listen, you just don't see it yet. You just haven't had that kind of transcendent experience to see why my abusive treatment of you is justified, right? And you know, so you can see how certain aspects of the kind of the mystical experience being beyond the pale, or they just don't see why this form of physical or sexual abuse is actually just a symbol of love, right? In disguise. They just haven't had the right change of frame yet. So how do you distinguish between, I guess, or how do you what are the red flags you look for those two differences between like something that's legitimate versus something that's more pathologically minded?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also not an easy question, but as much as it's not an easy question, it's a super relevant question because we all know of the tremendous amount of material, sexual, spiritual, I would even say, abuses that go on in contemporary forms of spirituality and traditions that consider themselves mysticism. I mean, these are the abusive guru is a cliche at this point because it's so rampant, unfortunately. And the question of how can we what can we use to judge that and to be an arbiter to call something out, to call a spade a spade, it is a great question, and I think it's an important question, particularly because of how much of the abuse is done under the name of spiritual advancement, and how much it's done under the name of the flourishing of the person who's being abused. I think I think that the basic principles of mysticism again here are clear enough to differentiate and to call a spade a spade. The mystic universally in their call for unity calls for love and calls for compassion, calls for sympathy and understanding. I think that's number one. That's not enough. I'm gonna add more to that. But I think that's the foundation. And I think that anything that's being done that's overtly in opposition to unity, to love, to compassion, to understanding is very clearly not within the pale of mysticism and can be categorically rejected. I think that's number one. Number two is that mysticism calls for humility, because if you realize that there is no real fundamental distinction between self and other, then there is no place for you to have ego. And the ego, classically amongst mysticism, at least an unrectified or an untreated ego, is the source of separation. And so anything that's been done in a way that's clearly simply there to aggrandize one's own ego and one's own pleasure at the expense of others is simply, I don't see how it could fly in mysticism if the basic predicate of mysticism is that there isn't a separation between self and other. If someone is doing something to further one's own agenda at the expense of other, that is contra-mystical, and I think it needs to be dismissed as such immediately for that reason. So I think that's already two very healthy places to begin with. And I think part of the danger in the gurification of mysticism that happens is that people somehow feel that they are inferior and they're not able to come to the realizations that their master has, and therefore they must hand over all of their credulity and their body and everything else to the master. And I think that, again, if you turn back to the literature of the mystics are constantly telling people that this experience is there for you to experience. You can reach, like, you are as much one with reality as anyone else is, and no one has more privy to that than you. There's a real democratization of the divine, of God, of the sacred, where anyone can come to that, and no one needs to submit oneself or to grade oneself. One can have guides, one can have teachers, one can have road signs which one learns from, one can have mentors and exemplars who show a path, who lead by example, that's fine. But to believe that unless I do something that's going to compromise myself to somehow gain the trust of this one person who is the bastion or the gateway to this ultimate knowledge or realization, that's nonsense. And I think that the mystics call it out as nonsense. I think that when we turn back to the classic literature of mysticism that has stood the test of time in inspiring people towards goodness, towards beauty, towards compassion, so much of what today passes under the name of mysticism, so much of the abuses that pass under the name of mysticism are so quickly thrown out and so quickly to be seen to be absolute nonsense.
I guess a slight concern and follow-up to that is so there's been instances where I've seen people who later get federally charged for sex trafficking crimes, and if you look at the recorded interviews with people before any of this kind of comes to light, they do preach this kind of sense of compassion, love for others, the kind of sacrifice that comes from being a truly kind of loving person. The kind of also it's generally humility. It's saying, well, I don't know if we're going to achieve this. We're hopefully providing a space for this to happen. So there's many elements in which I've seen signaled very well, and if I had not known those events took place, right, and had other kind of sources to confirm this, then I would have just been like, oh yeah, this sounds fine. Like this kind of checks all the boxes. This seems okay. And like the example I'm thinking of is actually from I'm not sure if it veers in the kind of mystical territory, but it was the Nexium cult. And there's a passage in an interview he does with some I guess television celebrity at some point, where he goes into this kind of spiel about like, okay, well, like how do you measure the depth of your love? And isn't that through pain? And kind of like it's not just the joy and like the happy moments. It's also like kind of like, okay, well they're in like a really bad place and you're willing to kind of help them, right, and kind of pull them out of that if possible. And he just goes in this very long, poetic, beautiful, good, true sounding thing. So even if they do have the message, right, what is like how does one, I guess, identify the form of contradiction, right? Because people can be very good at signaling, even though they don't have like the embodiment aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very important to say. I think that talk is really cheap, and people can say anything, and people can say that in very persuasive and eloquent and beautiful ways. And I don't think that we judge people based on what they say. I think that the fruits of what a person actually believes is in their actions, and we judge people by what they do, not by what they say. So if someone is preaching love and compassion and unity, but then they're hurting people and they're abusing people and they're marginalizing people, they can take all of their nice poetry and they could do what they want with it, but it's not converting into action. And if someone's doing that, then it's meaningless. Their words, not only are their words empty and meaningless, but it's an abomination, because they're proclaiming these high standards, and then they're going ahead and they're abusing them, and they're contradicting them. So I think that hearing what people say is so secondary to seeing how people are actually acting. And I think people to like carefully bring some benefit of the doubt. I think there are people who get caught up in a tradition or in a way of living that they are trying to exemplify love, but that love is not tempered by respect. There's a very classic image in Jewish mysticism where ahava, love, or chesed, loving kindness, is always has to be mirrored by gvura, by respect for the other, by boundaries. And I think that it's very important for people that are on this path to know that just because you're in a state of loving and embrace, it doesn't mean that the other person is willing and is in that space with you. And I think that there needs to be a real recognition of the autonomy of the other. And this is difficult for the mystic who's convinced that everything is fundamentally one. But for the mystic who believes that everything in existence is the ends in itself, is what we would call the ground of being, or the object of ultimate concern, to use Tillich's term, or to use simple, the three-letter word God. Therefore, the other that we encounter, that even if we don't fundamentally metaphysically believe that it is other, we have to treat it with the full autonomy of a divine being. And I think that place for autonomy and respect, which has to temper and counter simple, unmitigated love, is a difficult one. But I think that there's a lot of maturing happening in mysticism today, where people are realizing that love without respect is abuse, and respect without love is simply coldness, and they need each other to have flourishing relationships, flourishing families, flourishing societies. And that's in action. That's not in talk. That's not someone who's preaching love and respect. That's someone who's acting respectfully and loving towards others.
Beautiful. Thank you, Zevi. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks. AJP.
Zevi, thanks very much for taking your time to spend it with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
I mainly
pleasure.
want to say that, and I also just a comment that focus that the mystics have priority are on the mystical experience itself, and that people who are doing that as the thing that they're prioritizing is kind of like another expression of egoism is quite a profound one, and for me it's a little bit paradoxical, because at least I find when I think about it myself and when I talk to other people in my life about it, it's the kind of thing I'm drawn to, and as you get drawn closer then you realize that's the thing that can't be drawn to. So it's it's very strange. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but anyway. Thanks.
I had a bit of a hard time hearing the line. The line was cutting out a little.
You can repeat it if you want.
Please, yes.
Yeah, so I was just saying that being drawn to a mystical experience is how people might enter into a journey. But actually, if you're chasing that, that is not the right thing to chase, and it's another expression, or it could be an expression of egoism. And as you progress, you'll find that it's actually the opposite of the thing that you should be chasing. Did you hear that? Okay.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I really think that this point is so important to re-emphasize. What happened was, to give people a bit of a historical background here, what happened was that with the advent of the Enlightenment in Western Europe, there was a real worry that religion would have no legs to stand on once, and the scientific revolution, everything, like, religion was falling apart at the seams. It seemed like there was really nothing to hold it together. And part of the work that begins with Immanuel Kant and with Schleiermacher and a bunch of very fascinating Christian philosophers and theologians is to try and find a safe space that religion can rest unassailed by modern science and modern philosophy. And where they find this, Kant himself makes this case, Schleiermacher and others make this case, Schelling makes this case, that there's an experience of the numinous, experience of the sacred, and that is where religion rests, and that is unassailable because that is my own a priori experience. The case is made most extensively in Das Heilige, in a book called, translated as The Holy, from Otto Rank. Sorry, from Rudolf Otto. I always confuse the two of those guys. My apologies. One of them wrote a book called Das Heilige, the Holy, the Sacred, and so it was an attempt really to find a space where religion could be safe from the critiques of modernity, and it worked well. It really worked well as an intellectual project, and it did some good things for religion, in that it moved religion back to an experiential place, back to a place of freshness, and it moved away from simply dogmatism or simply abstract metaphysics that had no relation to experience. And it moved into a place where the lived practice, the lived life of the practitioner, of the religious practitioner, of the mystic, became less important than their experiences. And as you so eloquently said, it simply led to another form of egoism, another form of hedonism. And this is why so many contemporary scholars and philosophers, Bernard McGinn does not use the word, the guy just wrote a 3,000 page complete history of Christian mysticism from the beginning till the end. And in the very first opening introduction, he says, I'm not going to talk about mystical experience. I'm going to talk about the mystical awareness of being in the presence of God. And that's a Christian term. And a Buddhist will talk about it differently, and a Jew will talk about it differently. But the experience of living in the presence of that which is sacred, of that which is holy, of that which is not other than us, that is what mysticism demands, for us to live a life of mysticism. Not to be, experienced junkies running away from life, running away from our problems, running away from, but to live, to be in those things, and to experience the beauty, to experience the infinitude of those things. And experiences can help. Experiences can help open our eyes. They can help, who was it? William Blake speaks about the scales of our eyes being removed, the chinks in the cavern, in the cave, allowing the light to shine in. And for some people, they need that experience. They need the mind to be shattered open by mind shattering experience. But the question is then, what are you doing with your life following that? How are you living your life informed by these experiences, by these metaphysics? So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you for exploring that. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And I guess what you said there leads me to the question, and you spoke a bit about this with John, about John's project of the religion that's not a religion, as sort of a home for the nuns, the NONESs, the people who have sort of not found their place for whatever reason in the traditional religions. Do you have any thoughts on that as a project and the viability of that and
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, both in the sort of sociological, looking at who are these people that are identifying as the nuns. I think another overlapping sociological category, which is very quickly growing, is the spiritual but not religious. I think there's a lot of overlap between those two groups. There's and then on the metaphysical side, or the theological sort of narrative side, where John speaks about the non-theism. I think non-theism is something, and I think we spoke about this in our dialogue. It's something which the mystics have been talking about for forever. That God is not some sort of object that's out beyond the universe, or some sort of anthropomorphic figure with a big white beard who's going to come and strike us. Like, I think the mystics are tremendously non-theistic, and they find all kinds of ways of expressing that. And this is true for many mystical traditions. So I think it's a fascinating project, which John is continuing, which has been going on for thousands of years, on the historical, on the theological level. When it comes to the sociological, I think what we're seeing today is a huge like exit from the churches, where people are just abandoning the religions of their parents and grandparents en masse, and the tend towards secularity and modernity is just in huge waves. There's growing pockets of, I think, more fundamentalist, more conservative, religiously conservative communities, which will keep onto a form of religion as it's been practiced for hundreds of years, or at least in they think that they're doing something that's been practiced for hundreds of years. But I think what we're seeing is that this growing population of the nuns, there's a sense of emptiness. I mean, the human, for the good or the bad, we're the meaning-seeking creature, and anyone who's following John's project knows this, and that is a blessing and a curse. And I don't think people are going to be satisfied with endless Netflix, and with endless consumerism, and with endless partying, and with endless rat race, conspicuous consumption, living for the weekend to get back to work, to retire, to make the money so we can retire off to the Bahamas by the time that we're 65 and 70 and can no longer enjoy it. Like, that vision of reality that has been created with modernity and with the Industrial Revolution, and the audience that is John audience, I don't need to tell this, I don't need to repeat this. John has given the most thorough and comprehensive diagnosis of the symptoms and the causes of the meaning crisis. These people, myself included, and many of us, are turning back to philosophy, back to metaphysics, back to religion, back to our own experiences of reality, to try and guide a new vision. And I think there's a tremendous amount of potential for this. I do think it is the new future, and I think that it's where every field of sciences and humanities and philosophy is converging. Not to say that there's unanimity, and not to say that everyone is bowled over by the claim of the mystics, but I think if you read the literature, and this is something which I've spoken about with Guy Senstock on his channel, when you read the literature of the psychologists, the depth and humanistic psychologists, when you read the literature emerging from the new sciences, whether that's in ecology, in biology, in environmental sciences, or quantum physics, it seems to me that there's a new story which is being told. There's a new narrative which is being created, which is a narrative which is, as far as I see it, is a narrative which is completely dovetailing the story that the mystics have been telling for thousands of years. And to me, that's tremendously exciting. And to be able to reformulate the wisdom of the mystical traditions in a way that is compelling and palatable and persuasive and beautiful, and acceptable to a 21st century, critically, rationally, philosophically, scientifically minded person, to me that is the project which I see as so pivotal, which John is undertaking, and which the circle of people around him, and which I in small part hope to be taking a part of.
Firstius asks, do you think dodgy mysticism is something that those in power tend to gravitate towards, perhaps as a way to explain the position they find themselves in, or at least to fill their time, since they aren't troubled by daily toil and aspiration for wealth? It is said that the fish rots from the head down. So could bad mysticism, merged with power, be the root cause of our troubles?
Oh, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. I thought the question was a different one of the because I missed right in the beginning. I thought it was a question of people that are against the narrative that the mystic is trying to push, whether that where that is coming from the position of power in society. Do you mind actually rereading the question? Because I assumed that was the question, and therefore I didn't really understand it.
Sure. Do you
Can I
think?
can I read the question?
Yes, and you can look at in event text. Well, I'll read it for you, but you can read along in event text right above the event hall.
Oh,
Do you,
great. That's cool.
do you think dodgy mysticism is something that those in power tend to gravitate towards, perhaps as a way to explain the position they find themselves in, or at least to fill their time since they aren't troubled by daily toil and aspiration for wealth? It is said that the fish rots from the head down. So could bad mysticism, merged with power, be the root cause of our troubles?
Hmm. That's very interesting. So I thought initially, I when the fourth word here is dodgy. I thought it was dodging, which is a totally different question. It's an interesting question. Is dodgy mysticism something that those in power tend to gravitate towards? Um, Listen, I think people that are in power. I don't. Firstly, I don't think that anyone. I don't buy the notion that everyone that's in power is necessarily evil. I think there are people in power that wield their power in a very positive way for humanity and the world at large. So I don't equate power and evil. I think that's something that happens a lot in modern and postmodern thinking, which I don't buy entirely. Even if we do see a lot of corruptions of power, doesn't mean that power necessarily is associated with corruption. I I think that people that are in I think that dodgy people in powerful places um, can corrupt all kinds of things, and everything is corruptible. And people will corrupt mysticism, people will corrupt science, people will corrupt. I don't know if there's any specific, particular, like historical affinity between bad mysticism and people in power. Um, I think that like to best answer the question, it would be helpful to do just a simple historical analysis of like the what we would consider dodgy mysticism, where like from a place of social stratification, where is that emerged in society, and in which societies. I think it's an interesting question, but I don't know if there's necessarily a correlation, and also I don't know if there's necessarily a correlation either between not being boiled down by daily toil and aspirations for wealth, and necessarily that turning bad. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of good mystics throughout history, who don't care for wealth and therefore live much more freely and cheaply, and they live very beautiful lives, and there's nothing dodgy or malignant about it. So I think it's interesting. I think it would just be something which one would have to look into historically.
Struan asks, what do you make of the Book of Enoch? How much stock do you put in the as above, so below maxim, expressed both in Enoch and in the alchemical tradition?
Um, yeah. So it's interesting. The Book of Enoch, for those that don't know, is a period is a piece of literature from what used to be called the intertestamental literature. We now no longer call it that. It's now called um, the apocryphal literature. There's split into what used to be called intertestamental is now split into the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal, depending on how the attributions are made. But basically, there's this character Enoch who appears very very briefly in like one verse in the book of Genesis. Who all we know is that he walks with God and then he is taken up by God, and there's this because he doesn't really seem to die in the text, but ascends to be with God. So there's a whole very interesting. It's kind of like an early. There's a fellow YouTuber and scholar, Justin Sledge. He calls it I think he calls it the first like sci-fi or fan fiction of the Bible. And it's a very interesting text of this character Enoch. And one of the things which come, as you're saying, is this idea of as above, so below. In Hebrew and later used by the Kabbalists, they speak of malamaila malamata, that what is above is also what is below, which gets taken up in, as you say, in Enochian, in alchemical, and I would add in Kabbalistic and then Hasidic literature too. I think it's particularly, I think there's a lot of truth to it. I think from the basic metaphysical axiom that everything is one, when we see two things that seem to be separate, that principle leads us to assume that they're not separate, but they're reflections of one another. And I think that is best understood that way. That the cosmic reality is a reflection of the microcosmic reality, which I think is a principle which gets put forth very beautifully in many traditions. And I think it's a necessary consequence of the logic of mysticism, and I think it holds. What's interesting with Enoch in particular is that Enoch is the individual who is the human who becomes deified. Enoch, in many Kabbalistic traditions, becomes this demiurgical figure called Metatron, which then is used by later thinkers to speak about Enoch as the archetype of the human in general, how the human in general is the reflection or the earthly mirror to this divine archetype called Metatron, which is basically saying, in simple English, it's basically saying that the human is God and God is the human. I think if we're going to put it in very simple English, that's the Enochian relationship to that maxim. I hope that wasn't too obscure, that reference, but I hope that answered the question.
Andre, you have a question.
Hi, Zevi. Um, I was just thinking about when we look at mysticism and particularly Jewish mysticism in terms of the meaning crisis and finding meaning in life. Um, I've looked into it, and it seems to me that it's hard to be a pragmatic approach, applying the Kabbalah. Like I've studied the Tree of Life, the Liriani Tree of Life, and some of the Gematria. I've read the Torah, and as you know, with the Kabbalah, you're strictly not really supposed to read it before the age of 40. Um, Depending on what sect of Judaism you're in, I guess. And there seems to be a lot of barriers to entry to get that mysticism that could be applied to one's life and to get that metaphysics. Now, whereas if I approach from a different angle, say like the existential philosophers, particularly the phenomenologists and the existential psychiatrists like Irvin Yalom and Viktor Frankl. I find their work is incredibly approachable, and straight away they just answer the meaning crisis with practical and pragmatic approaches that can be read by anyone, and it seems to click for most people. So, how in modernity can we sort of balance that threshold between like the decades and millennia old mysticism and theology, and things that are more practical like psychiatry, existential psychiatry, and psychology? Would you say?
Yeah, thank you, Andre. That's a really great question. That's very spot on. I want to go back to something which began talking about earlier, which is the same way that we make a distinction between exoteric forms of religion, exoteric forms of theology, like theology as it's taught to us as children, and then there's the esoteric, there's the mystical side of things, there's the hidden, right, the inner and the outer. I think that within the esoteric, and this is not just my own idea, this is an idea from the traditions themselves, within the hidden, there's that same babushka doll again opening of the external and the internal. So within the mystical traditions, there's again the external and the internal. There's the exoteric and the esoteric. And what we were saying before about approaching mysticism from a comparativist or from a perennialist perspective is that we can begin to identify which parts of the traditions are the exoteric and which parts of the mystical traditions are esoteric. And I think that the exoteric packaging of within the mystical traditions are really very fascinating and interesting, and one can be a professor and explore them, or one can be a dilettante and have fun learning all about them, and that's cool. But I think that we need to get to the core of the traditions. We need to get to the shared truth amongst those traditions. To give a simple metric, if they're putting aside particular insights, particular moments of genius that only one tradition has and others don't, which is important. But putting those aside, which may invalidate this whole distinction I'm just thinking now, but putting those aside, the truths that are shared amongst mystical traditions, I think almost by definition are going to be those aspects that are the esoteric. The truth which is only going to be found in one religion, within one tradition itself, is almost by definition going to be that which is exoteric. And I think that that's a very important distinction to make. And I know a lot of people, and it pains me to see this, a lot of people, they turn to Jewish mysticism to try to find meaning, to try to solve the real issues of the meaning crisis, and they get stuck, in some very arcane, esoteric texts from the 13th century. They're like lost on gematrias and levels of cosmology, all things which I was like forced to learn when I was like 14, 15, 16. But they never really get to, I think because they spend so much time in the exoteric of the esoteric, in the exoteric parts of the mystical tradition, they never really get to the real heart of it, to the real truth, which I think is actually helpful. So that's point number one. Point number one is don't get lost in the weeds of a mystical tradition. You have to find its heart. And it's important to do that quickly, because you could spend years and years and years in the weeds. That's number one. Number two is that I think that the people you're quoting, the Irvin Young Loms and the Viktor Frankls and the Maslows and all these fellows, the Eric Froms, they are people who are taking from the mystical traditions, and they are channeling a lot of those real truths into the distinction between being and having. All these real truths, I think, are coming very strongly from the mystical traditions. And I know for a fact, with the Jewish names that you cited, that they are very much influenced by and quoting the Jewish mystical traditions in the truths which they're bringing to the modern person. So I don't think we should see these as two separate things. We should see these as one and the same project. The third thing which I want to end by saying to this is that and this is the point which John emphasizes, is that so we know from like good scientific research that people that identify with any given sapiential, mystical, or religious tradition have higher self-reported degrees of meaning and satisfaction. And I think that the simple reason is that these ideas themselves are not enough, and what they need to be accompanied by is, as everyone here I assume knows what I'm about to say, is an ecology of practices. And I think that an ecology of practices and a community of people that are pursuing these things together is specifically what these traditions have to offer. So if someone's engaging in Jewish mysticism, what I would say is, as someone who's been in this tradition for many years, is firstly, on a conceptual level, speak to people, figure out what is extraneous and what is essential, what is exoteric and what is esoteric within the tradition itself, and then use the practices of the tradition itself to ground one in a daily practice. So if one is just reading Irving Yalom and they don't have a routine in the morning, a routine at night, something which they're doing in the middle of the day to bring them back to being present, a routine around eating, a routine around whatever it is they're doing, and both a personal, private one, and also one which is social and connected and dialogical, then one's not going to get very far either. I think that is what these traditions have to offer. What they have to offer is very rigorous and very, very serious litanies of practices, personal and interpersonal. And I think for that reason, many of the modern perennialists, many of the modern scholars of perennialism that weren't just academic scholars but were practitioners, they went ahead, people who were endlessly advocating for the shared universality of the truths of these traditions, went ahead and converted or joined one specific mystical tradition to take on one specific practice, because conceptually we could be universal, but in practice I think it's really, really, really important to be committed. Commitment means that I'm going to do this, whether I like it or not. I'm going to wake up and begin my day with gratitude, whether I'm feeling grateful or not. I'm going to wake up and commit myself to a period of meditation, of silence, or of mantra, of whatever it is. And I think that is something which traditions have to offer, which just forms of modern humanistic or depth or analytical psychology don't have. And I think that they can complement one another in affording each other what they do have.
All right.
It's some good points there. I agree. So one doesn't need to sort of, as you say, like Yalom and Frankl. Like I know that Frankl specifically quotes Buber and Levinas and a few others, and Heidegger, and there are elements of other parts of mysticism there, but so you can approach the mysticism through that guise without having to say go and read the Tanakh or something like that. And to the last point, yes, the ecology practices, to me, like as someone who is largely into logotherapy, it's connecting like the ontological mode of being to the meaning. So you can't have the meaning of the everyday without being the being itself. And it's sort of like similar to Buber's I and now. It's having like the primary word and the secondary word, and being the subject. You have to be there and doing the things. So yes, I totally agree on that last part, and some very good points there. Thanks for answering my question.
Thank you for asking.
So we've gone about an hour and a half, so I want to start wrapping up. Just a couple last questions for you. You talked with John that you aspire to read the top 100 books about good books about mysticism. Now, I don't think that's realistic for most of us, but for those who want to dip their toes in and just find out a little bit more about what mysticism is all about, is there a book or two that you could recommend to people?
Yeah. I think there are some really books. If I could link to the text, I made a video on the channel a while back called like top 10 books to read on mysticism, and they're all secondary texts, and they're all aimed at people who are approaching the field and not people who are like deep already in the field. Maybe I'll just begin by copying a link to that and popping it here.
Sure, you could put in that in the event text. Yeah, that would be great.
That's
and that
and
leads
then I
to
can
my
even-
next question, which is to ask you to tell us about your website and your YouTube channel, Seekers of Unity.
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you if you don't have the time to actually watch it. In the list I have Joseph Campbell. I really do recommend almost everything that he wrote. The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Let me see what's maybe the best of this list here. I think that for general mysticism, William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, Aldous Huxley, The Perennial Philosophy. For more Christian mysticism, Evelyn Underhill's classic Mysticism. I think there's a lot of really good like first reads in that list. And I think in the video I actually like for every first read I accompany it with like a more advanced read for people who are interested as well. So that's what I can recommend. What was the second question, Brett?
Can you tell us about your website and your YouTube channel?
Yeah. So it's mainly the channel. The website is just like an auxiliary to the channel. So the focus is on creating video content around all the topics that we've been discussing here today. I'd been exploring these topics for a long time myself, and I wanted people to talk about them with, and I wasn't finding that, and I wasn't studying in university either. my background was in traditional religious education and then self-educated in philosophy and then other traditions of mysticism. So I was actually very scared to open my mouth at all and to share anything. It's quite terrifying. And anything that you put on the internet is there for everyone to see for all of time. It's like a permanent cyber tattoo. And that was very daunting. And a friend of mine for like 2 years consistently pushed me, encouraged me to go ahead and to begin to share. And then at one point when I was particularly isolated, I thought, okay, if I don't do this now, then I'm never going to do it. I'm just going to continue to be isolated with these ideas and not have anyone to talk to about. And so I did the most like unassuming thing I could do, which was just to post a book review. And I posted a book review of William Stace, Philosophy and Mysticism, which I think is one of the 10 recommendations in that list. And I got so much loving and supportive and positive and appreciative feedback. Um, and people said, we don't want just book reviews, we actually want to hear like more full presentations and dialogues and discussions. And now it's launched into this whole project, which I'm doing full time now for something like a year and a half, 2 years. I'm producing a video every week. I try to publish every Thursday if I can. And it's basically whatever's catching my interest at the time. And I go through different series. So we're doing now an ongoing series exploring pan and panentheism in the world's various theologies, all the way from ancient India to ancient Greece. We did some Christian pantheists and philosophical pantheists. We're now ending on Jewish pantheism, which is hardest for me because it's the one which I know most about, and therefore I know how little I know about it. And along with that, I'm doing a lot of really fun and exciting interviews with. I mean, I'm so blessed to have the opportunity to have done this and to be able to sit down and talk to people who I've been admiring and reading and thinking their thoughts, and to get to sit down and talk to them for 2 hours in love and dialogue and compassion and critical thought is really great. So we've done something like, I don't know, 25, 30 interviews, a mix of friends, practitioners, scholars, strangers, and yeah, so and classes that I've given to like specific class that I've been like commissioned to do for communities. I post them there as well. So it's like a one-stop shop for a philosophical exploration of mysticism from one particular vantage point. And I really want to encourage people not only to come and check it out and all of that, which is really important, and I would love that, but to come and join the community and to come and partake in the conversation. We have a lot of exciting things happening, people that are beginning to do Seekers meetups. And also, I really want to encourage people to share their own research and their own thoughts and bring their own puzzle pieces to the table, because that's what I think we need. I think we need everyone to come and to contribute. And I encourage people to come and to join the conversation, to create content. And yeah, I would love to see like a network, an army of people creating discussion, creating content, creating community around these ideas. And I think that's the work which John talks about, stealing the culture, and I think that's how it happens. And I think we have to. Yeah, the internet is a tremendous tool. It can be used extremely destructively, and it can be used extremely productively. And I hope we're doing the latter.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. Yeah, I put the link to your video in the chat there, and I'll post the link in the show notes as well. I really appreciate you being here with us today. This has been amazing, and thank you everyone for the great questions as well. And we hope to have you back.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Brett, for coordinating this and for inviting me, and thank you everyone who came and participated and joined and asked questions and thought together. And I hope this was as enjoyable and as fulfilling as it was for everyone else as it was for me.
Thanks so much.